Variations in latitude create opportunity for distinct climate zones, and biomes occur in distinct climate zones. A biome is a plant community typically characterized by the most dominant vegetation type in that location. So, biomes are characterized by distinct abiotic characteristics and the dominant vegetation, grasses, shrubs, trees. The type of biome present depends on climate and moisture relationships that are associated with latitude, so that in equatorial regions we'll find a different biome or vegetation composition than we find in the boreal parts of the world. Similar biomes occur at similar latitudinal bands. This strongly suggests a link between climate and geography, in this case with latitude. We divide the world into a number of different major biome types. In the far north, we'll talk about a tundra, grassland type vegetation. South of that, we'll have a boreal forest called a taiga. And then we have the temperate coniferous forests. We have deciduous forests, where the leaves are shed each year. We'll have grasslands, arid deserts, chaparral or Mediterranean climate vegetation, savanna biomes, and lastly, tropical rainforests. So these are the dominant biomes on Earth today. We can begin to see some general patterns. If we go to the equator, where it's wet and hot, in this equatorial region, we find the tropical rainforests. Often evergreen, that is, that the leaves persist throughout the year. And it's wet, virtually every month of the year. Wet and humid. If we move farther north and farther south to about 30 degrees north or south of the equator, where we have the descending air that I was describing, at about 30 degrees north and south, we find deserts. They're dry, they're frequent, but not always hot. In coastal regions, they may not be hot, but they certainly are in the interior regions. So at about 30 degrees north and south, we tend to find deserts with the descending air as the Hadley cell completes its ascension and descension of air. At about 45 degrees, as we begin to move north, we find seasonal deciduous forests. Here's a picture of a deciduous forest, and a good example would be the vegetation we find here in the northeastern part of North America. Moving farther north, we find the boreal forests, which are conifers, they're gymnosperms. They tend to be in regions that are wet and certainly are cold, with much of the year spent below 0 degrees C. We can begin to ordinate these relationships between the temperature on a certain part of the world and the amount of precipitation. And the first thing that we see is that not all combinations of temperature and precipitation can be found throughout the world. We have regions that are warm and have a high precipitation, and are cold and have a low precipitation. But we don't find regions that are cold and have high precipitation. This part of the triangle is missing, and that's because it's physically not possible to have high precipitation in an environment that's so cold. The air simply can't hold that mass of water. But we do find this triangular shape relationship between climate and between temperature and precipitation to form climate. And we find that distinct biomes occur in different regions. For instance, the tropical rainforests are in the warmest and highest precipitation regions. The tundra is found in the coldest and, it turns out, lower precipitation regions. And from the tundra, we find grasslands, and then eventually grasslands, as it gets warmer, give way to savanna ecosystems. So we have these gradients here, where different combinations of precipitation and temperature describe the dominant vegetation or biome in that part of the world. We find these patterns repeated over and over again on different continents. We can take a precipitation gradient. Imagine we got in our airplane and we were flying over the rainforests of Brazil. If we moved farther north, away from the equator, let's say up to Georgia or New York or the Carolinas, we'd find ourselves moving into a temperate deciduous forest. This graphic here turns out not to be from the eastern United States, but instead it's from Germany. But it's the same pattern as we move away from equatorial regions. We move from the rainforest into a deciduous forest. This is what happens in regions where we get summer rain. If we tend to look at moving away from the equator and the tropical rainforest into regions that are both drier and in particular drier in the summer, we tend to find the coniferous forests, such as the forests shown here in Mill Creek Canyon of Utah. As we move from temperate deciduous forests or coniferous forests into drier regions, particularly regions that are drier and get summer rain, we tend to find savannah biomes. And so this is a picture of a savannah biome in Tanzania within Africa. We can find similar gradients looking at the grassland vegetation, lower precipitation, but in the colder areas we find tundra. As the regions warm up, we find the Great Plains grassland. And as it gets even warmer, we find the Chihuahuan Desert or the Chihuahuan grassland. So in the previous slide, I'd shown you a transect with higher precipitation. Now I'm showing you a transect with lower, on average, precipitation. One of the things to observe, and we talked about this in the last lecture, that as we go along these biome and temperature gradients, we'll often find that we have ecosystems containing both C3 and C4 plants. C4 plants would be we would tend to find them in the savannas and the grasslands and in the deserts that have high temperatures and precipitation in the summer. In those areas where we have both grasses and trees, we will often find that the browsers are eating C3 trees, whereas the grazers are eating the C4 grasses in these warmer, summer wet biomes. So the class activity that we would participate in is asking, what happens if you find yourself in the tundra or the taiga and we say global changes have occurred and now the temperature is 5 degrees warmer? What kind of vegetation shift would we predict? Here I'm giving you the answer from our discussion. And if we are in this part of the taiga region and it got warmer, we would expect it to become a temperate forest. Similarly, the tundra, we might expect to become a grassland. So if these patterns between temperature and precipitation hold, then as climate changes, we might be able to predict with some certainty what kind of vegetation would replace the existing vegetation. We would go through a series of clicker questions asking you to identify where you find tropical rainforests, where you would find desert biomes, and where you would find deciduous forests.